Hello everyone, welcome back to our lectures in Module 2, Food, Senses and Memory. In the previous lecture, we examined Jhumpa Lahiri's short story, A Temporary Matter, and explored how food operates within the intimate space of domestic life. We saw how cooking, grocery shopping and shared meals become more than routine activities. They become ways through which memory, emotion and cultural identity are expressed. Food structured the rhythms of Shobha and Shukuma's relationship, recorded moments of intimacy in cookbooks and recipes, and even created temporary spaces of communication during the nightly blackouts. In the first lecture, we also drew on Sutton, who argues that bringing together the anthropology of food and the anthropology of the senses allows scholars to better understand everyday life. Eating, he suggests, crosses key boundaries between body and society, private and public, and individual and collective experience. Food, in this sense, becomes a powerful medium through which memories and lived experiences are revisited. Today, we continue exploring this relationship between food, the senses, and memory, but we shift from fiction to poetry. If Lahiri's story allowed us to see how food operates within the domestic interior of a house, today's text moves us outdoors into the landscape of childhood memory. Poetry often captures sensory experiences with particular intensity because it relies on condensed imagery, rhythm, and metaphor. A single taste, smell, or visual detail can evoke an entire emotional world. Scholars have increasingly recognized the importance of food in literary interpretation. In fact, a specific critical approach has emerged to study this relationship. The term gastrocriticism was coined by the scholar Ronald W. Tobin in 2002 to describe a multidisciplinary method that links gastronomy and literary analysis. As Tobin explains, gastrocriticism draws upon insights from fields such as sociology, anthropology, history, semiotics, and philosophy in order to examine how food functions within literary text. Within this framework, food in literature becomes a way of exploring broader questions about identity, memory, and cultural meaning. For example, in studies of Irish poetry, critics have noted how food and domestic spaces often carry symbolic significance. Eugene O'Brien has observed that in Seamus Heaney's poetry, the kitchen frequently functions as a locus amoenus, a comforting and nurturing space associated with warmth, security, and familial affection. In other words, food prepared and shared within the kitchen can symbolize emotional belonging and domestic stability. This brings us to the poet we will examine today, Seamus Heaney. Heaney was born in 1939 in rural county Derry in Northern Ireland and grew up on a farm in a large Catholic family. His childhood environment was shaped by agriculture, seasonal labor, and the rhythms of rural life. These experiences deeply influenced his poetry. Throughout his career, Heaney frequently returned to the landscapes of his childhood, fields, hedgerows, farms, and village roads, treating them as sites of memory and cultural identity. Heaney's poetry is often attentive to ordinary sensory experiences. The smell of soil, the sound of farm tools, the taste of fruit, or the feel of rain on the ground all become ways of reconnecting with the past. For Heaney, sensory encounters with the natural world often become the gateway through which childhood memories are revisited and reinterpreted. The poem we will read today, Blackberry-Picking, comes from Heaney's first major collection, Death of a Naturalist, published in 1966. This collection, which established Heaney as a major poetic voice, explores childhood experience, rural labor, and the formation of identity. The collection begins with one of Heaney's best-known poems, Digging, and includes the acclaimed Death of a Naturalist and Midterm Break. At first glance, Blackberry-Picking describes a group of children gathering ripe blackberries during late summer. It appears to narrate a simple rural activity. Yet, as the poem unfolds, it becomes clear that the experience carries deeper emotional meaning. It can be fruitfully read as a poem rich in food imagery, where the act of gathering and consuming berries becomes a sensory experience that reflects desire, pleasure, and eventual disappointment. Through vivid descriptions of taste, texture, color, and smell, the poem transforms a simple childhood activity into a meditation on the fleeting nature of sensory delight. We will first have a line-by-line analysis with emphasis on the theme, sensory perception, and the taste memory. Thereafter, we will move on to sub-themes that place the poem in the recurring context of Heaney's poetry. Heaney begins the poem with gratifying sensory imagery that draws the reader directly into the experience of tasting the fruit. The first ripe berry is described as a glossy purple cloth, an image that conveys thickness, richness, and concentration. The word cloth suggests something dense and viscous, implying that the berry contains the distilled essence of the season itself. When the speaker tastes it, its flesh was sweet like thickened wine, a simile that elevates the fruit to something luxurious and intoxicating. The phrase "summer's blood was in it" deepens this imagery by presenting the berry as the very life force of summer. The language introduces a subtle tension from the onset. Words such as cloth and blood evoke vitality and richness, but they also carry associations of injury, decay, and mortality. It also foreshadows the inevitable perishment of the berries. The sensory experience quickly turns into desire. Once the first berry is tasted, the children feel a lust for picking. The word lust transforms a simple childhood activity into something driven by instinctive appetite. The sweetness of the fruit stimulates an urge to gather more and more, linking food imagery with the dynamics of craving and excess. Heaney reinforces this through vivid visual and tactile imagery. The children collect berries in everyday containers, milk cans, peat tins, jam pots. These domestic objects place the activity within a culture of food gathering and preservation, suggesting an attempt to store nature's abundance. The act of picking also involves direct interaction with the briars, the blackberry bushes with their long stems and sharp thorns. Moving through them exposes the children to scratches and discomfort, reminding us that gathering food from nature often requires physical effort. The poem also notes how the grass bleached the boots, suggesting the effect of dew or moisture on the grass, which lightens the boots and reflects the brightness of daylight. This detail reinforces the sensory experience of the landscape, highlighting the tactile and visual dimensions of the activity. The next line briefly sketches the agricultural landscape of rural Ireland in the phrase "round hay fields, cornfields, and potato drills." In just a few words, Heaney evokes the material culture of Irish farming. The reference to potato drills, the rich rows used to cultivate potatoes, also carries historical resonance. Potatoes became a crucial staple crop in Ireland, particularly for poorer farming communities working difficult soil. In this sense, the image subtly recalls Ireland's history of agrarian hardship and the central role that potato cultivation played in sustaining rural populations, especially in the shadow of the 19th century famine. As the containers fill up, the berries appear as big dark blobs that burn like a plate of ice. This striking image initially evokes a table of food ready to be eaten, yet the comparison to ice introduces an unsettling undertone. The imagery in this moment also takes on a darker tone with the reference to Bluebeard, a well-known European folktale figure associated with the murder of his wives. Heaney writes that the children's palms become sticky with berry juice, sticky as Bluebeard's, a comparison that evokes the image of blood-stained hands. The dark juice of the blackberries thus acquires a slightly sinister quality, transforming the innocent act of berry picking into something tinged with violence and guilt. This striking metaphor complicates the earlier sense of delight and abundance. The children's lust for picking is now shadowed by imagery that suggests excess and transgression. The sensory imagery then shifts dramatically, continuing the darker undertone introduced earlier. The scene moves to byre, the cattle shed, where the children store their gathered berries. The fruit is hoarded in a heap, but the abundance quickly turns into despair. A rat-grey fungus appears on the berries, its texture described as resembling fur. Heaney writes that the fungus is glutting on our cachet, a phrase whose heavy consonant sounds almost mimic the act of devouring, giving us an instance of onomatopoeia. The image suggests excess and consumption, as though the fungus itself is greedily feeding on the children's carefully gathered treasure. This moment marks a striking reversal in the poem's sensory imagery. The berries that once promised sweetness now begin to decay. The juice becomes stinging, and the fruit that was sweet would turn sour. Through this transformation from ripeness to rot, Heaney illustrates the natural cycle of food decay. For the child speaker, this change is both shocking and disappointing. The hoarded berries, once symbols of abundance and excitement, become lovely canfuls that smell of rot. Fermentation here also carries a paradox. In many cultures, it produces valued foods like wine, but in the poem, the children experience it only as rot and disappointment. This movement from sweetness to spoilage mirrors a deeper psychological shift. The speaker's childhood hope that the berries would last forever confronts the reality that they inevitably rot. The reaction, "I always felt like crying, it wasn't fair," marks the moment when innocence gives way to understanding. In this way, the life cycle of the fruit becomes a metaphor for the broader human realization that moments of abundance and pleasure are always fleeting. Thus, food imagery in the poem operates on multiple levels at once. It engages the senses, captures the excitement of childhood discovery, and ultimately reflects on time, desire, and loss. The blackberries move through a full sensory cycle, from sweetness and abundance to fermentation and decay. Through the sensory richness of the blackberry, its color, taste, and decay, Heaney transforms a simple act of berry picking into a meditation on memory and the impermanence of sweetness. Heaney is not the only poet who uses food as a sensory object in poetry. We might also briefly compare this sensory attention to food with the work of the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, whose famous elemental odes celebrate everyday foods such as tomatoes, lemons, garlic, and wine. Critics Bob Marrow and Anne M. Carson note that Neruda conceived these poems as homages, moving beyond simply describing food to reflect on larger themes such as justice, compassion, and humanity's place within the natural world. Like Heaney, Neruda uses intensely sensory language to evoke the experience of food. You can pause and read this sumptuous extract from the Ode to the Congo Chowder, a homage to a traditional Chilean seafood soup. Now you take garlic. First, caress that precious ivory. Smell its irate fragrance. Then blend the minced garlic with onion and tomato until the onion is the color of gold. His poems linger on smell, taste, and texture, describing garlic as ivory with pungent scent, or lemon as a fruit whose fragrance almost overwhelms the senses. In poems like Ode to a Tomato or Ode to a Lemon, fruit and vegetables become not merely objects of nourishment but symbols of shared human experience. Through these everyday foods, Neruda celebrates what he sees as the collective joy of sharing the earth's gifts, reminding readers that food connects individual pleasure with communal life. Seen alongside Neruda's poetry, Heaney's blackberries take on an even broader resonance. They are not simply childhood fruit, but part of a larger poetic tradition in which food becomes a way of thinking about nature, memory, and human belonging. Having examined the sensory image in detail, we can now step back and look at some broader themes that recur in Heaney's poetry. The first sub-theme is seasonal cycles and the rituals of gathering food. Heaney situates the entire experience within the rhythm of late summer. The poem begins late August, given heavy rain and sun for a full week. The blackberries would ripen. The ripening of the berries depends on rain, sunlight, and time. Human beings cannot control this process. They can only wait for the right moment. Critics such as Anka Klitzing note that many of Heaney's poems return to these recurring cycles of food production and gathering. Activities like harvesting, fishing, foraging, or collecting wild fruits become ritualized moments in rural life. Blackberry picking is a part of a larger seasonal pattern of food acquisition in rural communities. In the poem, the children wait for the berries to ripen and then rush out with containers, signaling the repeated yearly activity, a ritual of anticipation. The excitement of gathering fruit reflects the rhythms of agricultural societies, where seasons determine when food becomes available. Yet, as Klitzing observes, these cycles also remind us of human limitations. Nature ultimately determines the outcome. The final lines of the poem captures this sense of powerlessness in the face of natural processes. Each year I hoped they'd keep, knew they would not. The cycle of ripening and rotting repeats every year, reminding the speaker that time and decay are inevitable parts of the natural world. The second sub-theme concerns foraging and the material culture of food. Heaney's poetry frequently refers to foods that are hunted, fished, or gathered from the landscape, such as oysters, eels, crab apples, and wild berries. Unlike elaborate culinary traditions such as French haute cuisine, the food culture represented in Heaney's work is often simple, local, and rooted in rural practice. We already mentioned that in Blackberry-Picking, the children collect berries using milk cans, jam pots, and pea tins. These objects reflect the material culture of everyday food practices. They are ordinary domestic items repurposed for gathering and storing fruit. Klitzing points out that most foods we consume are originally products of both nature and culture. Even when food grows naturally, human beings transform it into something edible and meaningful through cultural practices. Psychologist Paul Rosen describes this process as the transformation of natural materials into food through human cultural activity. The poem therefore captures a moment where nature and human culture intersect. The third sub-theme is the food work and identity. Across Heaney's poetry, food production and food gathering often become ways of thinking about collective and individual identity. Activities such as farming, digging potatoes, or churning butter are practices through which communities define themselves. Klitzing identifies this as a recurring gastronomical theme in Heaney's work, identity forming productive food work. Although Blackberry-Picking focuses on children rather than farmers, the poem still reflects this relationship between labor and food. The act of picking berries involves physical effort. The children scratch their hands on thorns, stain their palms with juice, and carry heavy containers back home. The poem describes this vividly. Our hands were peppered with thorn pricks. This tactile imagery reminds us that food rarely appears effortlessly. Even gathering wild fruit involves bodily engagement with the landscape. Heaney explores similar ideas in other poems from the same collection. For example, in Churning Day, the communal labor of making butter transforms cream into what Heaney famously calls coagulated sunlight. The act of churning becomes both a physical and almost spiritual transformation. In these poems, food work does not merely produce food, it also produces community, memory, and identity. The final sub-theme we will explore is appetite and desire. While hunger is a biological need and taste shapes cultural preferences, appetite often carries deeper psychological meanings. It suggests desire, longing, and sometimes excess. In Blackberry-Picking, the children's excitement quickly turns into an intense desire to gather as many berries as possible. This hunger is not simply about nourishment. The children are driven by the thrill of abundance. They want to collect more and more berries, filling every available container. However, this abundance cannot last. Once the berries are stored, they begin to ferment and rot. The poem describes this transformation with striking imagery. A rat-grey fungus glutted on our cache. The sweetness of the fruit gives way to decay. Scholars of food culture have long discussed the tension between desire and restraint in eating practices. Sociologist Stephen Menel, building on Norbert Elias's idea of the civilizing process, argues that societies develop rules to control individual appetites for the collective good. In Heaney's poem, the children's appetite for sweetness confronts the limits imposed by nature. No matter how carefully they store the berries, they cannot stop the process of decay. This realization transforms the poem from a childhood memory into a reflection on the impermanence of pleasure. Now, we analyze the poem from different angles. You might have a question of why Heaney chose blackberries to convey his memory. Also, why does fruit appear so frequently in poetry? Literary scholar Carol Dietrich, in her discussion of fruit in modern poetry, suggests that fruit occupies a very special place in literary imagination because it embodies what she calls a sensory, sensuous, sensual configuration. Fruit appeals simultaneously to multiple senses. It is visually striking, aromatic, tactile, and pleasurable to taste. Because of this multisensory richness, fruit becomes an ideal object through which poets can explore the relationship between the body, perception, and desire. Dietrich notes that throughout art history, fruit has held a prominent position not only in poetry but also in visual art. One only needs to think of the long tradition of still life paintings of fruit in European art. These images do more than represent food. They organize sensory information into a form that invites contemplation. Fruit thus becomes not just an object of description but a sensory unit that can be transformed into literary form. The poet takes the sensory experience of fruit, its color, taste, texture, and smell, and shapes it into language. At the same time, fruit also carries another layer of meaning, pleasure. Unlike many staple foods, fruit has long been associated with delight, temptation, and abundance. In poetry, therefore, fruit often becomes a symbol of sensory enjoyment and desire. Dietrich proposes that a triangle of the sensory, sensuous, sensual be superimposed on Lévi-Strauss's triangle in order to analyze most fully the manner in which unprocessed substances like fruit or poems which focus on fruit may fit into a nature-culture dichotomy. This connection between fruit and poetic form was famously expressed by the American poet Archibald MacLeish in his poems Ars Poetica, where he writes, "A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit." Seen in this light, Heaney's blackberries become much more than a rural detail. They operate as an ideal poetic object, something that is visually vivid, sensorially rich, and emotionally evocative. We might also observe that the poem quietly traces what we could call a sensory culinary triangle, congruent to Strauss's culinary triangle. The berries first appear in their natural state, ripening on the bush through rain and sun. The children then intervene by gathering and storing them, attempting to transform nature's abundance into something they can keep. Finally, the fruit ferments and rots, reminding us that food remains subject to the cycles of nature and time. In other words, the fruit in Heaney's poem becomes the perfect medium through which sensory experience, memory, and poetic reflection come together. In today's lecture, we explored Seamus Heaney's poem Blackberry-Picking as a powerful example of how food imagery can evoke sensory memory and emotional reflection. Building on the ideas introduced earlier in the module, particularly David Sutton's argument that food connects bodily sensation with social and cultural experience, we examined how the poem reconstructs a childhood moment through taste, smell, touch, and visual imagery. The blackberry becomes more than a fruit. It becomes a sensory trigger through which memory, desire, and disappointment unfold. Through close reading, we saw how the poem moves through a cycle from ripeness and abundance to fermentation and decay. This movement reflects not only the natural life cycle of food, but also a deeper realization about the impermanence of pleasure. We also discussed broader themes in Heaney's poetry, such as seasonal cycles, rural food work, and the relationship between labor, landscape, and identity. Finally, we placed the poem within a wider poetic tradition, where fruit functions as a rich sensory object, drawing comparisons with poets like Pablo Neruda. In this way, the poem also helps us reflect on this week's guiding question: how do the senses, especially taste and smell, shape our memories and emotional experiences of food? In the next lecture, we will continue exploring this question through cinema as we turn to the German film Mostly Martha, where cooking and taste become central to understanding character, emotion, and transformation. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you in the next lecture.